Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this: a desert before dawn, silent and still. Then, in a single flash, the night becomes brighter than the sun, and history itself changes forever. This is the story we're about to enter together, the history of the atom bomb, and how its fire has shaped the world we live in today. Before we begin, I'd love to ask you to support the channel. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a message in the comments telling us where in the world you're listening from. Your words help build a community here, and they truly keep this channel alive. Now, it's time to let go of the day. Find a comfortable place, settle your breathing, and let your mind drift as the story unfolds. Sit back, relax, and allow the journey to begin. Part 1. The Dream of the Atom. Human beings have always searched for the hidden patterns of the world. Long before machines, before laboratories, before equations and particle accelerators, people wondered what lies beneath the surface of things. They broke stones and found smaller stones. They cut wood and found finer splinters. They boiled water and watched it vanish into steam. They touched fire and saw it transform solid fuel into smoke. With every observation came a quiet question: what is the world really made of? In the sunlit hills of ancient Greece, nearly 25 centuries ago, a man named Democritus gave one of the first daring answers. He believed that if you could take any substance and divide it over and over, eventually you would reach a final piece that could not be divided further. This smallest unit he called atomos, meaning uncuttable. To Democritus, the world was not a continuous fabric but a dance of countless invisible grains moving in a void. The sweetness of honey, the bitterness of wormwood, the solidity of iron, the softness of wool, all of these were combinations of atoms of different shapes and arrangements. It was only a theory, without instruments to prove it. No eye could see an atom. No hand could feel one. But the thought itself was radical. Democritus imagined a hidden architecture of reality, a universe where even gods and men were made of the same tiny building blocks. The idea was too far ahead of its time. Most thinkers, and especially the mighty voice of Aristotle, dismissed it. Aristotle spoke of the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water, combining endlessly to form all things. His explanation was easier to grasp, and it held sway for nearly 2,000 years. Democritus's vision faded into the background, remembered only in fragments, like a seed buried in deep soil, waiting for an age when the ground would be ready. Through the Middle Ages, curiosity about matter never truly died. In dim stone chambers, the alchemists stirred their vessels and whispered of hidden essences. They dreamed of transmuting base metals into gold, of finding the elixir of life, of discovering the philosopher's stone. Their practices were wrapped in mystery, often more spiritual than scientific, but their experiments kept alive the conviction that matter contained secrets waiting to be unlocked. They observed, they mixed, they heated, they failed, and yet each failure carried knowledge forward. The centuries turned, and with the rise of the scientific revolution, people began to measure instead of guess, to observe with instruments instead of relying only on philosophy. The telescope revealed moons around Jupiter. The microscope showed tiny creatures in drops of water. The universe, once thought complete, was suddenly vaster and stranger than imagined. Out of this spirit came a return to the ancient idea of indivisible particles. In the early 19th century, in the damp climate of England's northwest, a modest schoolteacher named John Dalton looked closely at the behavior of gases and chemicals. He noticed that when elements combined, they always did so in simple whole number ratios. Water was not a vague mixture of wetness but a precise combination. Dalton concluded that each element was made of tiny, identical units, atoms, that joined with other atoms in fixed proportions. He revived the word Democritus had whispered centuries before. Dalton's picture of the atom was simple, like tiny billiard balls colliding and linking together. He could not see them, but the mathematics fit, and the theory explained why chemical reactions were predictable. His atomic theory spread, and with it came a new confidence that the building blocks of matter were finally within the grasp of human thought. Still, no one had ever seen an atom. They were concepts, helpful for explaining reactions but invisible to any microscope of the time. Many scientists treated them as useful fictions. Yet experiments kept pointing back to their reality. As the 19th century unfolded, stranger discoveries emerged. In laboratories lit by flickering gas lamps, researchers experimented with cathode ray tubes, glass tubes with a vacuum inside, through which mysterious greenish rays glowed when electricity was passed. These faint lights suggested that atoms were not solid after all, but contained smaller parts. In 1897, J. Thomson announced that he had found a particle within the atom, the electron. Suddenly, the atom was no longer indivisible. It was a miniature universe, with components of its own. The revelation was both thrilling and unsettling. If atoms could be broken, what else might be inside? Experiments accelerated. In 1909, Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealand physicist working in England, performed his famous gold foil experiment. He and his assistants fired tiny positively charged particles at a thin sheet of gold. Most passed straight through, but a few bounced back as if they had struck something solid. Rutherford realized that atoms were mostly empty space, with almost all their mass concentrated in a dense center, the nucleus. Around it, electrons moved like distant planets around a sun. It was a revolutionary picture. What seemed solid, wood, stone, flesh, was mostly void. The table under your hand, the ground beneath your feet, your own bones, were built of vast spaces bridged by invisible forces. The solidity of the world was an illusion created by fields of energy. Not long after, the Danish scientist Niels Bohr refined this vision. He proposed that electrons did not move randomly but orbited the nucleus in specific shells, jumping from one level to another while releasing light. His model helped explain the colors of chemical flames and the patterns of spectra. It was as if the atom was a tiny solar system, with a glowing rhythm all its own. By the early 20th century, the atom had gone from dream to detailed picture. Yet the greatest secret was still hidden inside. In 1905, a young patent clerk in Switzerland published a set of papers that would change physics forever. Albert Einstein was only 26, unknown outside small circles. In one of those papers, he showed that energy and mass were interchangeable, linked by a simple but profound equation: E equals mc squared. The formula meant that even a tiny amount of matter contained an immense store of energy. A speck of dust, if fully converted, could unleash more power than thousands of tons of coal. At the time, it seemed purely theoretical. No one imagined a way to release that energy. But the principle was there, like a fuse waiting to be lit. The dream of the atom had become more than philosophy, more than chemistry. It had become a key to the forces of the universe itself. The 1910s and 1920s brought still stranger revelations. Quantum theory began to show that electrons did not orbit like planets after all, but behaved as both particles and waves. They existed in clouds of probability, appearing and disappearing in ways that defied common sense. The atom was not only tiny, it was strange, living by rules that seemed to belong to another realm. And then, in the late 1930s, the unimaginable happened. In Germany, physicists discovered that certain atoms, like uranium, could be split. When a uranium nucleus absorbed a neutron, It broke into smaller nuclei, releasing more neutrons and a burst of energy. Each new neutron could split another nucleus, setting off a chain reaction. What had been a theoretical reservoir of energy was suddenly real. Humanity had found the match to light Einstein's fuse. Yet all of this still belonged to the future. Before mushroom clouds, before devastation, there was the long dream, the whisper of Democritus, the experiments of Dalton, the glow of cathode rays, the flashes of Rutherford's detectors. For centuries, people had reached toward the hidden world of matter, each discovery another step down a path they did not fully understand. When the dawn of the atomic age finally arrived, it would be both wonder and terror. But here, at the end of the first chapter, it is enough to stand in quiet reflection at the threshold. The atom, once only an idea, had revealed itself as real, structured, and powerful. Humanity had not yet asked what it would do with this knowledge. The question hung in the air, waiting. The dream of the atom was alive, and it would change the fate of the world. Part 2. Unlocking Nature's Secrets. The atom, once a dream spoken in the quiet of ancient Greece, had taken on new shape in the 19th century. Dalton's solid spheres explained chemical reactions. Thomson's discovery of the electron revealed an inner structure. Rutherford's experiments showed a dense nucleus at the heart of emptiness. Bohr's vision of orbiting shells gave order to the atom's invisible dance. Yet even with these revelations, the atom was still more mystery than certainty. The early decades of the 20th century were a time of scientific upheaval. The old world of certainty, of fixed rules and clockwork predictability, was being replaced by something stranger. Atoms did not always behave like miniature planets, moving in neat orbits. They flickered between possibilities, sometimes behaving as particles, sometimes as waves. The deeper scientists peered, the more reality seemed to resist simple explanation. In quiet laboratories, lit by long rows of lamps, a new generation of scientists worked late into the night. They handled delicate instruments, cloud chambers that revealed the ghostly trails of particles, spectrometers that split light into patterns like fingerprints, Geiger counters that ticked faintly with invisible signals. These tools allowed the unseen to become faintly visible, glimpsed only for a moment before vanishing again. One of the central figures of this era was Marie Curie. With her husband Pierre, she had already uncovered the strange property of radioactivity at the turn of the century. From pitchblende, a heavy black mineral, she isolated elements like radium and polonium, substances that glowed faintly in the dark, releasing energy from within. It was as if the atom itself leaked a secret light. Marie worked tirelessly, often in exhausting and dangerous conditions. In makeshift laboratories, she stirred vats of crushed ore, distilling tiny traces of new elements. She did not yet know how dangerous the rays were, and her body absorbed the toll. Her notebooks from those years still remain too radioactive to touch safely. Yet her discoveries marked a turning point. The atom was not only a structure of shells and charges, it was alive with hidden forces. The work of Curie and others revealed that atoms could change, one element transforming into another, releasing invisible particles of energy. This was a startling revelation. For centuries, alchemists had dreamed of transmutation, turning lead into gold. Now, it seemed that atoms could indeed alter their identity, though in ways far stranger than medieval dreamers had imagined. In Cambridge, Ernest Rutherford continued to probe deeper. His gold foil experiment had shown that atoms contained a small nucleus. Now, he sought to understand that nucleus. In 1919, he succeeded in splitting the nucleus of nitrogen by bombarding it with alpha particles, creating oxygen. It was the first artificial nuclear reaction in human history. A door had opened. Around him gathered a group of brilliant young scientists, men like James Chadwick, who would later discover the neutron in 1932, and Niels Bohr, whose insights into atomic structure would reshape physics. The laboratories of Cambridge and Copenhagen became hothouses of discovery, where chalkboards filled with strange equations and particles seemed to multiply with every passing month. Meanwhile, across Europe, new theories were taking shape. Quantum mechanics emerged, a framework that described atoms not as tiny machines but as systems ruled by probabilities. The German physicist Werner Heisenberg spoke of uncertainty, that one could never know both the position and momentum of a particle with complete precision. Erwin Schrödinger offered his famous equation, describing the atom as a wave of possibilities. Paul Dirac combined relativity and quantum theory, predicting particles that had not yet been seen. To the wider world, these discoveries were baffling, like riddles in a foreign language. Even to scientists themselves, they felt unsettling. The old image of neat orbits gave way to clouds of probability, invisible patterns that could only be described with mathematics. The atom was no longer a stable, predictable object. It was a mystery woven with uncertainty, and yet it worked. These equations explained chemical bonds, electrical currents, the colors of stars. Step by step, the atom's inner world revealed itself. The proton, carrying positive charge, joined the electron in shaping matter. The discovery of the neutron, heavy and neutral, completed the picture of the nucleus. Protons and neutrons bound together in the atom's heart, held by a force stronger than anything else in nature, the strong nuclear force. Without it, matter would fly apart. With it, the atom could hold the energy of stars. The realization came slowly. The forces inside the atom were immense. If they could be unlocked, the energy would dwarf anything produced by fire, steam, or electricity. The sun itself burned with nuclear reactions, fusing hydrogen into helium, releasing light and warmth across millions of miles. To capture even a fraction of that power on Earth was beyond imagination. Yet in the 1930s, a discovery in a Berlin laboratory brought the unimaginable closer. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, working with uranium, found that when bombarded with neutrons, the heavy nucleus could split into two smaller nuclei. Their colleague Lise Meitner, with her nephew Otto Frisch, explained what had happened. The nucleus had undergone fission, a breaking apart that released additional neutrons and vast amounts of energy. The chain reaction was suddenly more than theory. Each fission released neutrons that could split more nuclei, creating a self-sustaining cascade. A small amount of uranium could, in principle, release energy equal to thousands of tons of chemical explosives. The atom, once a symbol of indivisibility, had revealed a hidden violence. The news of fission spread quickly across the scientific world. Some saw it as a marvel of physics, a confirmation of theory. Others felt a deep unease. The year was 1938. Europe was on the brink of war. The thought of such energy in the hands of armies and governments was chilling. The dream of the atom, so long a pursuit of knowledge, was shifting into something heavier. In America, a handful of scientists realized the danger. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian émigré, immediately grasped the potential for weapons. He imagined bombs powered not by fire or chemicals but by nuclear fission. With a sense of urgency, he sought to warn leaders. Soon he would approach Albert Einstein, asking him to lend his name to a letter that would change history. But those moments belong to the next part of the story. Here, at the close of this chapter, it is enough to pause with the feeling of discovery. Humanity had unlocked nature's deepest secrets. The atom was no longer only a philosophical dream or a scientific model. It was a source of hidden energy, a power both wondrous and terrible. The seed planted by Democritus had grown into a towering tree. Its roots reached into the void, its branches touched the stars. But in its heart burned a fire that could never be put back once released. The dream had become a reality, and the world was standing on the edge of transformation. Part 3. Einstein's Letter. By the late 1930s, the atom had revealed its secret fire. In a quiet Berlin laboratory, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had split the nucleus of uranium, while Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch had understood the meaning, nuclear fission. The discovery was not only scientific, it was prophetic. For those who grasped the implications, it meant that humanity now stood on the threshold of a new age, one in which the energy of stars could be summoned on Earth. At first, the news moved like ripples across the scientific world. Physicists were astonished by the elegance of the reaction, the sudden release of energy when a uranium nucleus broke into smaller parts. The process released additional neutrons, which meant the reaction could, in theory, multiply. A chain reaction. A single neutron could start a cascade, splitting atom after atom, each release adding to the next. The mathematics of it was staggering. A few pounds of uranium, if arranged correctly, could unleash as much energy as thousands of tons of TNT. The numbers suggested something no one had ever seen before, a bomb that could destroy an entire city. Among those who understood the implications most clearly was Leo Szilard. Born in Hungary, Szilard had studied physics in Berlin in the 1920s. He was brilliant, restless, always filled with ideas. He had already conceived of the concept of a nuclear chain reaction years earlier, imagining how neutrons might multiply in matter. When he heard of Hahn and Strassmann's results in 1939, he realized immediately that the theory could become reality. Szilard had fled Germany as Hitler rose to power. Like many Jewish scientists, he carried with him not only knowledge but fear. He knew that German physicists, equally brilliant, had access to the same discoveries. If Nazi Germany were to develop an atomic bomb first, the consequences for the world would be catastrophic. In the spring of 1939, Szilard began to warn others. He spoke with fellow émigrés, men like Eugene Weiner and Edward Teller, who also understood the danger. Together, they discussed how to alert the United States government, a nation that had not yet entered the war but whose resources could make such a project possible. Szilard knew that his own name carried little political weight. He was a scientist, an immigrant, and still relatively unknown outside academic circles. To be heard by world leaders, he needed a voice of authority, a figure respected not only for science but for wisdom. He thought of Albert Einstein. Einstein, by this time, was already a legend. His theory of relativity had transformed physics. His face, with its wild hair and thoughtful eyes, had become a symbol of genius itself. He had fled Germany as well, leaving behind his homeland in protest of the Nazi regime, and now lived quietly in Princeton, New Jersey. Though he was not directly involved in nuclear research, his famous equation, E=mc², had provided the key insight that mass could be converted into energy. In the public imagination, no one represented the power of modern physics more than Einstein. Szilard arranged to visit Einstein in the summer of 1939. He was accompanied by Eugene Weiner and later Edward Teller. They drove to Einstein's summer cottage on Long Island, a modest wooden house where the great scientist enjoyed sailing and moments of solitude. The journey itself felt heavy with meaning. In the back seat of their car, Szilard carried not only papers and calculations but the weight of the future. Einstein greeted them warmly. He was older now, 60 years old, but still sharp, his manner calm, his voice gentle. He listened as Szilard explained the discovery of fission and the possibility of a bomb. At first, Einstein did not fully grasp the details. He had not been following the latest experimental work closely. But as Szilard laid out the chain reaction and the potential for devastating weapons, Einstein grew serious. The scientists explained that uranium deposits existed in significant quantity in what was then the Belgian Congo, controlled by Belgium. They feared that Germany, already aggressive in its expansion, might gain access to these resources. If the Nazis obtained sufficient uranium and developed the technology, they could create a bomb capable of destroying entire cities. Einstein, usually a pacifist, was troubled. He had long opposed militarism. Yet he also understood the danger of Hitler with such a weapon. His moral instincts battled with his scientific understanding, but in the end, he agreed, the United States government had to be warned. Together, they drafted a letter. It was addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Written primarily by Szilard, but signed by Einstein, the letter was measured in tone but urgent in meaning. It explained that recent work had made it possible to imagine powerful new bombs. It suggested that the United States should accelerate research into nuclear fission, stockpile uranium, and establish close relations with scientists studying the matter. Einstein's signature gave the letter gravity. Without it, perhaps it would have been ignored, buried among countless reports and warnings that reached Washington in those anxious days. With it, the letter carried the voice of the world's most famous scientist. The letter was delivered to Roosevelt in October 1939, just weeks after Germany had invaded Poland, beginning the Second World War. At first, Roosevelt's response was cautious. He created a small committee to explore the matter, but resources were limited, and attention was focused on more immediate military needs. For months, the idea of an atomic bomb remained distant, almost speculative. Yet the seed had been planted. Over the next 2 years, as the war spread across Europe and Asia, as France fell and Britain endured the Blitz, the urgency of nuclear research grew. Reports from abroad suggested that German physicists were working on similar projects. Slowly, the United States began to allocate more funds, to involve more scientists, to expand the effort. The letter, signed by Einstein, became the first step on the road to what would be called the Manhattan Project, the vast secret program that would eventually build the atomic bomb. For Einstein himself, the letter would become a burden. Though his role was limited to lending his name, history would forever link him to the creation of the bomb. In later years, he regretted signing it, saying that if he had known Germany would not succeed in building the weapon, he would not have acted. He lived the rest of his life advocating for peace, for disarmament, for a world where nuclear power might serve humanity instead of threatening it. But in 1939, none of that was certain. The war was spreading. The future was uncertain. In that moment, Szilard and his colleagues felt they had no choice. The atom had revealed its fire, and the only question was who would wield it first. It is striking to reflect on how quietly this turning point unfolded. There were no headlines, no public debates, no parades of armies. Just a few men, gathered in a summer cottage, writing a letter. The sound of pens on paper, the weight of words forming in careful sentences, the gravity of a signature. And yet that letter marked the beginning of an age that would define the 20th century. From Democritus's dream of indivisible atoms, to Dalton's spheres, to Curie's glowing elements, to Rutherford's nucleus, to Bohr's orbits, the journey had been long, filled with curiosity and wonder. But with Einstein's letter, the dream shifted into something else. It became a warning, a tool of survival, a weapon waiting to be born. The atom was no longer only the subject of philosophers and scientists. It had entered the halls of power. It had become a matter of war. The letter was only a few pages long, but its echo would be felt across decades. From the deserts of New Mexico to the cities of Japan, from the missile silos of the Cold War to the treaties of modern times, the path began here, with a drive to Long Island, a conversation with Einstein, and a letter to Roosevelt. At the close of this chapter, the world still stood in uncertainty. The bomb did not yet exist. The war raged in Europe, and America remained on the sidelines. But the course was set. The atom's fire had been glimpsed, and leaders had been warned. The chain reaction of history had begun. Part 4. The Manhattan Project begins. The letter signed by Einstein had been sent in 1939, but for a time it stirred only faint ripples in Washington. War had broken out in Europe, yet the United States remained hesitant, still half asleep in the shadow of neutrality. President Roosevelt had created a small advisory committee on uranium, but its funds were meager, its influence limited. In the early months, only a handful of physicists and government officials spoke of chain reactions and atomic weapons, and to most ears it sounded like the language of science fiction. But history has a way of shifting quickly. By 1941, the world was aflame. Nazi Germany had conquered much of Europe, its armies stretching from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. Japan had begun its push across Asia. The United States, though not yet a combatant, was preparing for the possibility of war. And within the halls of American science, momentum was gathering. It began quietly. Small laboratories, often housed in universities, took up the study of uranium and chain reactions. Experiments were modest, using piles of graphite bricks and small amounts of uranium to test whether neutrons could be slowed and multiplied. In Chicago, physicist Enrico Fermi, an Italian émigré who had fled Mussolini's fascism, led some of these efforts. He was calm, deliberate, a man with a gift for simplifying the complex. His experiments in the autumn of 1941 hinted that a sustained chain reaction might indeed be possible. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. Battleships burned, sailors died, and America was thrust into full war. Overnight, the nation's mood changed. Research that had once seemed abstract or speculative now became urgent. If the war was to be fought to the end, no stone could remain unturned. In early 1942, the United States government transformed the scattered uranium committees into something far greater. The new project was given a code name, the Manhattan Engineer District, soon shortened simply to the Manhattan Project. Its mission was simple in words, impossible in scope: build an atomic bomb before Germany did. The task required secrecy on a scale never before attempted. Laboratories would be built in remote deserts and hidden valleys. Entire towns would spring up, their residents sworn to silence, their lives contained behind barbed wire. Hundreds of thousands of workers, scientists, engineers, machinists, soldiers, clerks, would labor together, most of them never knowing what they were creating. Only a handful of top leaders would see the whole picture. At the center of this effort was a man named Robert Oppenheimer. A theoretical physicist from California, Oppenheimer was brilliant, charismatic, and troubled. He was fluent in multiple languages, fond of poetry, and known for his sharp intellect. Though not the most accomplished experimental scientist, he had a rare gift for bringing minds together, for seeing the whole tapestry where others saw only threads. In the spring of 1942, General Leslie Groves of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was appointed to direct the Manhattan Project. Groves was practical, demanding, and tireless, a man who understood logistics and command. He needed a scientific counterpart, someone who could unite the scattered efforts into one vision. He chose Oppenheimer. It was an unlikely pairing, the soldier and the dreamer, the engineer and the poet. Yet together they would lead one of the most ambitious undertakings in human history. Secrecy required isolation. A site was chosen in the remote desert of New Mexico, on a plateau near the small town of Santa Fe. There, amid mesas and distant mountains, the government built a secret laboratory. It became known as Los Alamos. To the outside world, it was just a collection of anonymous buildings in the desert. To those within, it was the heart of the atomic project. The life of Los Alamos was strange, almost otherworldly. Families were uprooted and brought to the desert, told little of what their husbands or wives would be working on. Mail was censored. Telephones were monitored. Scientists who had once lectured in crowded universities now lived behind guarded gates, their children playing in dusty yards while their parents calculated the fate of nations. The atmosphere was a mixture of intensity and monotony. In the laboratories, chalkboards filled with equations. Graphite piles were stacked, instruments calibrated, endless calculations checked and rechecked. In the evenings, there were dances, lectures, and games of tennis. A community formed, but always under the shadow of secrecy. People spoke freely among themselves, but never to outsiders. Even within the project, many knew only fragments of the whole. Meanwhile, other sites bloomed across America. In Tennessee, the town of Oak Ridge rose almost overnight, built to house tens of thousands of workers. There, immense facilities were constructed to separate uranium isotopes, a process requiring vast machines and enormous amounts of electricity. In Washington state, at Hanford, reactors were built to produce plutonium, a new element discovered only in 1940 but soon to become the core of one of the bombs. Each site was a world unto itself. Oak Ridge buzzed with the hum of collutrons and gaseous diffusion plants, workers laboring in shifts around the clock. Hanford's reactors glowed with eerie light, guarded heavily, their waste flowing into the Columbia River. Los Alamos, by contrast, was quiet and cerebral, filled with blackboards and arguments, minds straining to solve the puzzle of the bomb's design. The scale of the project was almost incomprehensible. By the war's end, it would employ more than 125,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion, more than any other scientific endeavor in history up to that time. And yet all of it was hidden, cloaked under the bland name of the Manhattan Engineer District. Most Americans had no idea such a project even existed. For the scientists at Los Alamos, life was a blend of exhilaration and unease. They were chasing discoveries at the edge of knowledge, working with materials barely understood, building machines and weapons that had never before been imagined. The challenge was intoxicating. At the same time, many wrestled with the moral weight of their work. They knew that what they were building was not a new engine or a new machine, but a weapon that could erase cities. Some justified it as a necessity of war, a race against Hitler. Others buried their doubts under the urgency of the task. Oppenheimer himself embodied this tension. He was deeply committed to the project, yet haunted by its implications. He read the Bhagavad Gita, the ancient Hindu scripture, and spoke of its verses to friends. In those words, he found echoes of the burden he carried. He once said that physicists had known sin, for they had looked upon what was possible and chosen to pursue it. The work advanced in layers. First came theory. Could a chain reaction be sustained? Then came engineering. How to enrich uranium, how to produce plutonium, how to assemble the materials. Then came design. How to make a bomb that would detonate reliably, without fizzling, without wasting the precious fuel. Each stage required ingenuity, trial, and error. Months turned into years. Across oceans, the war consumed millions of lives. Battles raged in North Africa, in Italy, in the Pacific. Soldiers died by the tens of thousands. Cities were reduced to rubble. And in the quiet desert, behind fences and sensors, another battle was being fought, a race not against armies, but against time. In December 1942, under the stands of a football field at the University of Chicago, Fermi and his team built the first self-sustaining nuclear reactor, known as Chicago Pile 1. It was a crude structure of graphite blocks and uranium, stacked like a giant black monument. On December 2nd, they pulled out the control rods, and the reaction began. Neutrons multiplied, the chain reaction sustained itself, and for the first time, humanity had tapped the steady fire of the atom. The scientists cheered quietly, aware that they had crossed a threshold. From that moment, the project accelerated. By 1943, Los Alamos was a hive of activity, filled with new recruits from across the Allied world. British scientists joined, bringing their expertise from parallel projects. Military police patrolled the gates. Inside, debates raged about designs, about implosion versus gun-type assembly, about the mathematics of detonation. The secrecy was profound. Families lived side by side, yet husbands could not tell wives what they were doing in the laboratory. Workers at Oak Ridge twisted knobs and read gauges without knowing that they were enriching uranium. Engineers at Hanford maintained reactors without being told that they were producing plutonium. The truth was compartmentalized, parceled out in fragments, guarded by sensors and clearances. Only at the highest levels did the full picture come into focus. By 1944, the bombs were beginning to take shape. One design, known as Little Boy, would use enriched uranium. The other, Fat Man, would use plutonium and a complex implosion system. Both were experiments in scale, built with materials more precious than gold, assembled by hands that often did not know what they were touching. And yet, through all of this, doubt lingered. Could it be done in time? Would the war end before the bomb was ready? And if it was built, should it be used? These questions remained unanswered as the work pressed on. The Manhattan Project was no longer an experiment. It was a machine, vast and relentless, consuming money, labor, and secrecy, driving toward a single outcome. In the desert, children played in dusty yards while their parents wrestled with the physics of annihilation. In the mountains of Tennessee, workers lined up for cafeterias and buses, their ID badges checked at every gate. In Washington state, the glow of reactors lit the night. And in Washington, D.C., generals and officials waited for progress reports, knowing little of the details, but trusting that something extraordinary was being forged. The Manhattan Project had begun not with a roar, but with a whisper, a letter carried to Roosevelt, a warning signed by Einstein. Now it had grown into an enterprise larger than anyone had imagined. The dream of the atom, once the pursuit of philosophers and scientists, had become the center of the greatest secret in the world. The story was no longer only about discovery. It was about power, war, and destiny. And as 1945 approached, the world was rushing toward the moment when the desert itself would blaze with a light brighter than the sun. Part 5. Oppenheimer's Burden. The Manhattan Project was vast, but at its center stood a man who carried its vision like a flame and its weight like a chain. His name was J. Robert Oppenheimer. When General Leslie Groves chose Oppenheimer to lead the scientific effort at Los Alamos, many were surprised. Oppenheimer was not the most celebrated physicist of his generation. He had made his name in theoretical physics, exploring quantum mechanics and cosmic rays, but he had not won Nobel Prizes or built great machines. He was slight of build, often sickly, his manner both intense and reserved. Yet Groves saw something in him, an ability to inspire, to organize, to weave together the talents of others. Oppenheimer was a man of contrasts. He was brilliant, fluent in several languages, able to quote poetry as easily as physics. He read the Bhagavad Gita, Dante, and Donne. He could charm a room with quick wit, or wound with sharp words. He was restless, driven, and often consumed by his own inner storms. His colleagues admired him, but they also sensed his fragility, as though he carried too much within himself. When he arrived at Los Alamos in 1943, Oppenheimer threw himself into the work with feverish energy. The laboratory was still taking shape, its buildings rising from the dusty plateau of New Mexico. Scientists and their families trickled in, adjusting to the harsh winds, the isolation, the long days of secrecy. In this strange new community, Oppenheimer became both leader and symbol. He walked the halls late at night, moving from office to office, checking calculations, offering encouragement, debating theories. He listened closely, asked questions, and pressed for answers. He had an uncanny ability to grasp the essence of a problem, even outside his own specialty. Chemists, engineers, metallurgists, and mathematicians found that he could enter their discussions with insight, seeing connections that others missed. Yet leadership came with burdens. The scientists at Los Alamos were brilliant, but they were also independent, used to freedom in their work. Now they were bound by secrecy, by deadlines, by the knowledge that their efforts were aimed at building a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen. Some resisted, some hesitated, some questioned. Oppenheimer had to hold them together, to keep morale alive, to remind them of the urgency. He often invoked the shadow of Nazi Germany. Many of the scientists were émigrés who had fled Europe, leaving behind families and friends. The thought that Hitler might acquire the bomb first was enough to silence doubt for many. Oppenheimer himself believed this race justified the work, at least at the beginning. But even as he pressed his colleagues forward, he felt the unease growing within himself. He lived with contradictions. By day, he directed the design of bomb casings and implosion lenses. By night, he read poetry and spoke of philosophy. He quoted lines about death and destiny, even as his teams calculated critical masses of uranium and plutonium. Friends remembered how his eyes seemed to look beyond the room, as if he were already haunted by what was to come. Los Alamos was both a fortress and a village. Children played in the dirt roads, wives organized dances, families gathered for picnics in the desert sun. Yet behind closed doors, physicists argued over neutron cross-sections, chemists refined plutonium, and engineers tested detonators. The contrast was sharp, the innocence of family life set against the hidden labor of destruction. And Oppenheimer moved between both worlds, bearing the knowledge that tied them together. He smoked constantly, his thin frame wrapped in jackets against the desert chill. He spoke quickly, his voice soft but insistent, his hands often trembling. Those around him saw a man who was both inspired and tormented. Some adored him, some feared him, but all followed his lead. The weight he carried was not only organizational, it was moral. Oppenheimer knew that what they were building was not just a new kind of weapon, but a shift in the destiny of humanity. He had once said that, in their work, physicists had known sin. It was not a religious confession, but a recognition that they had glimpsed something forbidden, power beyond human scale, and had chosen to pursue it. As the months passed, the pressure grew. The war in Europe raged on. News of concentration camps, of mass slaughter, of endless battles reached the desert. Each message added urgency, each loss a reminder that the world was burning. Yet there was also the question, what would happen if the war ended before the bomb was ready? Would their work have meaning then? Would the bomb still be used? Oppenheimer rarely spoke his doubts aloud, but those close to him could see the strain. He grew thinner, his face more gaunt. His eyes darkened with sleepless nights. He poured himself into the work as if to outrun his own questions. And there was always Groves, the general, pushing for progress. Groves was blunt, practical, focused. He cared little for poetry or philosophy. To him, the bomb was a military necessity, and Oppenheimer was his chosen instrument. Together, they formed an uneasy partnership. The soldier who demanded results, the scientist who supplied them, each bound to the other by the gravity of the mission. As the designs advanced, Oppenheimer faced another burden, the problem of choice. Two types of bomb were being pursued, one using uranium, the other plutonium. The uranium bomb was simpler in principle, but required immense effort to produce sufficient material. The plutonium bomb was more complex, demanding an implosion design that many doubted could be made to work. Oppenheimer had to guide his teams through both paths, knowing that failure in either could doom the project. Every decision carried weight. Every calculation meant lives. He knew that a successful bomb could end the war, but he also knew that it would unleash suffering beyond measure. His colleagues sometimes asked if the weapon should be demonstrated in an empty area, as a warning. Others argued it must be used directly, to shock the enemy into surrender. Oppenheimer listened, debated, but carried no clear answer. At night, the desert was silent. The stars hung over the mesas, bright and cold. In that stillness, Oppenheimer walked alone, his mind restless. He thought of ancient texts, of gods of destruction, of the fate of humanity. He thought of his own role, not as discoverer, not as soldier, but as the man who held the threads together, weaving knowledge into a weapon. It was a burden no one else could carry, and it pressed heavily on him. As 1944 turned to 1945, the project neared its climax. Uranium was being enriched at Oak Ridge. Plutonium flowed from the reactors at Hanford. At Los Alamos, designs solidified, explosives were tested, calculations refined. The bomb was becoming real. And with each step, Oppenheimer's burden deepened. He once remarked to a friend that, in the desert, they were witnessing a new history of man. He said it with awe, but also with sorrow. For he knew that once the bomb existed, it could never be forgotten. It would live in the world as long as humanity endured. The burden of creation is often invisible. The world would one day remember the mushroom clouds, the devastation, the surrender. Few would remember the man walking the dusty roads of Los Alamos, smoking nervously, quoting poetry, holding together a community of exiled minds. Yet it was here, in this desert isolation, that Oppenheimer bore the weight of a choice larger than himself, larger than any war. He carried the burden of the bomb, and though history would call him its father, he himself would remain a man torn between pride and regret. The work pressed on, the calculations sharpened, the detonators assembled. Soon there would be a test, and the burden would take form in fire. But for now, in the quiet desert, Oppenheimer's struggle was not only with physics or engineering. It was with his own conscience, with the heavy knowledge that he was leading humanity across a threshold from which there would be no return. Part 6. The Test in the Desert. By the summer of 1945, the Manhattan Project had become a giant machine, its pieces scattered across America but converging toward a single purpose. At Oak Ridge, uranium had been separated with immense effort. At Hanford, plutonium had been bred in reactors that glowed with otherworldly light. At Los Alamos, the designs had matured into physical form, bombs, not just ideas. And now, all that remained was the test. The chosen site was a remote stretch of desert in southern New Mexico, a place of flatlands, scrub brush, and distant mountains. The Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, was its name in Spanish, a barren land that had once tested the endurance of travelers. Now it would test something far greater, whether the atom's fire could be controlled, whether a human-made star could be born on Earth. The project leaders called it simply Trinity. The name came from Oppenheimer himself, inspired by a poem of John Donne, the 17th-century English writer who spoke of divine power and terrible grace. It was a fitting choice, for the test carried with it both science and scripture, calculation and destiny. Preparation began months before. Engineers built a steel tower 100 feet high, a skeletal frame rising out of the desert. At its top would be placed the plutonium device, a sphere of carefully machined metal surrounded by explosives designed to implode it inward with perfect symmetry. The bomb itself was nicknamed the Gadget. It looked crude, a collection of wires and bolts, but inside it lay the culmination of years of work, the focus of countless minds and endless resources. Around the site, bunkers and observation posts were constructed. Cables ran across the sand, instruments were positioned, cameras were mounted. Scientists prepared to measure radiation, shock waves, and light intensity. Every detail mattered. This was not only a test of a bomb but of knowledge itself, the validation of theories written in chalk, the proof of equations scratched in notebooks. As July approached, tension grew. The war in Europe had ended in May, Germany defeated. Hitler was gone, the camps liberated, the continent in ruins. But the war in the Pacific still raged, and Japan showed no sign of surrender. American leaders waited impatiently, demanding results. The bomb had to be tested before it could be used, and the window was closing. In early July, the scientists and soldiers gathered in the desert. They lived in makeshift camps and barracks, eating in mess halls, working day and night under the brutal sun. Dust coated their clothes, sand clung to their boots, and yet their minds were elsewhere, fixed on the sphere of plutonium, the question of whether it would ignite. The weather became an obsession. For the test to succeed, the sky had to be clear enough for measurements, the winds calm enough to prevent radioactive fallout from drifting toward nearby communities. Meteorologists watched the skies with nervous eyes, their forecasts carrying as much weight as the physicists' equations. Among the scientists, feelings were mixed. Some were excited, eager to see the culmination of their work. Others were fearful, haunted by the thought of what was about to be unleashed. Rumors circulated of possible outcomes. Would the bomb fizzle, failing to detonate properly? Would it explode with unexpected force, perhaps even igniting the atmosphere, as some half-serious early calculations had suggested? No one could be entirely certain. Oppenheimer himself carried the weight most heavily. He walked the desert with his thin frame and nervous energy, smoking constantly, his mind racing. To colleagues he seemed calm, focused, but inside he was a storm. He quoted poetry, lines about death and rebirth, as if to steady himself with words. In truth, he knew that history itself was about to shift, and he was the man standing closest to the fault line. The night of July 15th stretched long. Thunderstorms gathered on the horizon, flashes of lightning illuminating the desert sky. The rain pounded the tents, raising fears that the test would have to be delayed. Scientists and soldiers waited anxiously, staring out into the darkness. In the early hours, the storms began to pass, leaving behind heavy clouds but clearing skies. The decision was made. The test would proceed at dawn. At 5:30 in the morning, July 16, 1945, the countdown reached zero. In the stillness before, the desert seemed almost asleep. The horizon was a faint gray, the mountains outlined in shadow. In bunkers miles away, Men crouched behind dark glasses, shielding their eyes. Others lay flat on the ground, their faces turned from the tower. Cameras whirred, instruments ticked, nerves tightened. And then, light. Not the light of dawn, nor of lightning, nor of fire. A light beyond comparison, brighter than the sun, flooding the desert with a brilliance no human eye had ever seen. It rose in an instant, searing, white, overwhelming. For a fraction of a second, night turned to day, and shadows carved themselves into the sand. The tower vanished in the blaze. The bomb consumed itself, the plutonium imploding and releasing its hidden energy. A fireball expanded outward, its edges glowing, its center a furious white. The desert floor melted into glass, a substance later called trinitite. The shockwave followed, rolling across the land with a thunderous roar, shaking bunkers, rattling bones, echoing through the mountains. In the bunkers, men watched in silence. Some gasped, some cursed, some laughed nervously. No one spoke for long moments. They were witnessing the dawn of a new world. Oppenheimer himself stood among them, silent, his face pale. Later he would recall a line from the Bhagavad Gita, spoken by the god Vishnu, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It was the only language he could find for what he had seen. Others remembered him whispering, "It worked." For a few seconds, fear lingered. Had the explosion ignited the atmosphere? Would it spread beyond control? But soon it became clear that the fireball had subsided, contained within its own violence. The desert lay scorched, but the world endured. The test was a success. The bomb worked. News spread quickly within the project, but remained hidden from the outside world. In the coming days, officials would brief President Truman, who had just arrived at the Potsdam Conference in Germany. The weapon was now real, ready to be used. Decisions would have to be made. For the scientists, emotions were complex. Relief, triumph, awe, and dread mingled together. They had proven their theories, validated their years of labor, created something unprecedented. And yet, many could not shake the sense that they had unleashed a force beyond human measure. In the crater, the sand had fused into a green glass, still warm, silent testimony to the fire that had passed. Around it, the desert returned to quiet. The wind blew, the sun rose, the scrub brush stood unchanged. Only those who had seen it knew that the world had altered. The Trinity test marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The atom, dreamed by Democritus, refined by Dalton, revealed by Curie and Rutherford, harnessed by Fermi and Szilard, shaped by Oppenheimer, had now been set aflame. What remained was the question of use. The bomb existed. The war continued. Choices loomed. But those choices belonged to another part of the story. Here, in the Jornada del Morto, at 5:30 in the morning, humanity crossed a threshold. The desert held the memory of light brighter than the sun, of fire born from the heart of the atom. And in that moment, the burden of knowledge became the burden of history. Part 7. Decision in the White House. Far away in Potsdam, Germany, President Harry S. Truman received the report. The Trinity test had proven that the bomb worked. What had once been theory and secrecy was now reality. In his hands, Truman held a weapon that could end the war, or redefine it. Truman had been president only a few months. He had taken office in April 1945 after the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, stepping suddenly into the most powerful role in the world. Unlike Roosevelt, who had guided the nation through the Depression and much of the war, Truman was less experienced on the international stage. He was plain-spoken, decisive, often blunt. Now he faced a choice unlike any leader before him. At the Potsdam Conference, Truman sat with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, the leaders of Britain and the Soviet Union. Together they discussed the shape of the post-war world, the fate of Germany, the division of Europe, the war still raging in Asia. Yet behind Truman's calm words, he carried a secret none of them knew. In his pocket was knowledge of a new power, a bomb of unimaginable force. He had been briefed only after taking office. Roosevelt had kept the Manhattan Project so secret that even his vice president had not been told. When Truman first learned of it, he was stunned. Now, with Trinity's success, he was faced with the question, what should be done? Back in Washington, committees of scientists, military officers, and government officials debated. Among them was the Interim Committee, created to advise on nuclear matters. Chaired by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, the committee included statesmen and scientists. They discussed not only military strategy but also moral responsibility. Several options were placed on the table. One was to use the bomb directly against Japan, striking a military or industrial target to force surrender. Proponents argued that this would end the war swiftly, saving countless American and Japanese lives that would otherwise be lost in an invasion. Another option was to stage a demonstration, to detonate the bomb on an uninhabited island or remote area, inviting Japanese officials to witness its power. Perhaps the shock alone would be enough to compel surrender, without the loss of civilian life. A third possibility was to delay use altogether, to continue conventional warfare and see if Japan might surrender under blockade and bombardment, sparing the world the precedent of atomic destruction. The arguments were fierce. Military leaders pressed for direct use. They pointed to the casualty estimates for an invasion of Japan. The planned assault on the home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall, was expected to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and perhaps millions of Japanese. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had shown the ferocity of Japan's defense. To them, the bomb was a terrible but necessary tool to end the war without such losses. Scientists were divided. Some, like Edward Teller, saw the bomb as a triumph, eager to see it tested in war. Others, like James Frank and the authors of the Frank Report, warned against using it on cities. They argued that a demonstration would be wiser, that unleashing such destruction on civilians would stain America's moral standing and ignite an arms race. They feared not only what the bomb would do to Japan, but what it would do to humanity. Stimson himself was thoughtful, weighing the options with care. He visited Truman, speaking not only of strategy but of legacy. The use of the bomb, he said, would place America at the center of history, for good or ill. Yet he, too, leaned toward direct use, convinced that only shock and devastation would bring Japan's leaders to surrender. Truman listened. He was not a scientist, not steeped in the mathematics of chain reactions or isotopes. He was a man of politics and war, faced with the responsibility of ending the bloodshed. Each day the Pacific War continued. Soldiers died in foxholes, sailors were lost at sea, civilians perished in bombed cities. To Truman, the bomb was not an abstraction. It was a chance to end it. At Potsdam, on July 26, 1945, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, calling on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. The words were chosen carefully, hinting at the bomb without revealing it. Japan did not respond. Its leaders, bound by honor, divided by indecision, remained silent. And so the decision hardened. The bomb would be used. Truman authorized the plan in late July. The Target Committee had already selected possible cities: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. Kyoto, though considered, was spared at Stimson's insistence. He had visited the city, admired its cultural heritage, and argued passionately to protect it. The chosen targets were not only military but symbolic, cities that would demonstrate the bomb's power unmistakably. Even as the orders were given, doubts lingered among some of the scientists. At Los Alamos, a group petitioned against the use of the bomb on civilians. Their words reached Oppenheimer, who read them but did not forward them to higher authorities. He believed, or at least told himself, that the decision was no longer theirs to make. The bomb was in the hands of leaders, and the scientist's role was finished. For Truman, the choice was heavy but clear. He later said he never lost sleep over it, though those who knew him believed the burden was real. He saw the bomb as a weapon of war, and in war weapons were used. To him, not using it, after spending billions, after years of secrecy, after thousands of lives already lost, seemed unthinkable. The machinery of war moved swiftly. At Tinian Island in the Pacific, the 509th Composite Group prepared their planes, modified B-29 bombers capable of carrying the new weapons. Crews trained in secrecy, their missions known only to a few. The bombs themselves were assembled, their components shipped carefully across oceans, guarded like treasure. In Washington, in Potsdam, in Los Alamos, in Oak Ridge, the decision reverberated. Some cheered, believing the war's end was near. Others recoiled, fearing what was about to be unleashed. And in Japan, life went on, unaware. Children walked to school, trams rattled down city streets, factories hummed, families cooked rice in small kitchens. The shadow was approaching, but the people beneath it could not see. The desert test had proven the bomb. The White House had decided to use it. The order was set in motion. In less than 3 weeks, the light of Trinity would fall upon cities, and the world would never again be the same. Part 8. Hiroshima. The city of Hiroshima lay along the delta of a river, its streets spreading out like veins from the water. Bridges arched gracefully across the channels, trams clattered through narrow roads, and tiled rooftops stretched toward the horizon. In early August of 1945, the city was alive, though weary. Japan had been at war for years. The people had endured shortages, rationing, and air raids. Yet Hiroshima itself had been spared the worst. While Tokyo and Osaka had burned in waves of incendiary bombing, Hiroshima remained largely untouched. Its citizens whispered that perhaps the gods had protected them, or that the city's bridges and rivers had confused the bombers. On the morning of August 6th, life unfolded as it always did. The sun rose over the hills, casting light across wooden houses and quiet gardens. In narrow alleys, shopkeepers opened their doors, sweeping the dust from entryways. In kitchens, mothers stirred pots of rice, preparing simple breakfasts. School children shouldered satchels and set off in small groups, their voices carrying through the streets. Workers reported to factories and offices, bicycles rattled along the roads, and fishermen cast nets into the river. The air was warm, the sky mostly clear, with only a few clouds drifting lazily. For the people of Hiroshima, it was just another summer day. High above, far from the eyes of those below, a plane approached. The Enola Gay, a silver B-29 bomber, had left the island of Tinian hours earlier. Its mission was secret, known only to its crew. In its bay hung a single weapon, codenamed Little Boy, assembled with painstaking care. Inside it was uranium enriched at Oak Ridge, the result of years of labor, billions of dollars, and the work of thousands who had never been told what they were building. At 8:15 in the morning, the Enola Gay reached the city. Its bomb bay doors opened. The weapon was released, beginning its silent fall. Below, life continued in ordinary rhythm. On the streets, people looked up at the drone of engines, but many had grown used to the sight of American planes flying high overhead. Few alarms were sounded. Hiroshima had seen reconnaissance flights before, and the absence of large squadrons suggested little danger. Children laughed, shopkeepers counted coins, clerks filed papers. The bomb fell for 43 seconds. In that time, it crossed the boundary between science and history, between theory and reality. At 8:16 a.m., it detonated. There was no warning, no gradual crescendo. In an instant, the sky ignited. A flash of light brighter than the sun enveloped the city. For those at the center, it was instantaneous. One moment standing, the next consumed. Shadows etched themselves into stone. Silhouettes burned into walls where bodies had stood. The blast wave followed, tearing through streets with unimaginable force. Houses collapsed, bridges splintered, factories crumbled. Fire leapt from building to building, fueled by wooden structures and summer winds. Within minutes, much of the city was aflame. Those who survived the initial blast staggered into the open, their clothes scorched, their skin burned. Many were dazed, unable to comprehend what had happened. Mothers searched for children, children for parents. Rivers filled with people seeking relief from the heat and fire. Above, the mushroom cloud rose, swirling upward in colors of orange, gray, and black. From the air, the crew of the Enola Gay watched in silence. The city below was obscured by smoke and dust, a boiling cloud where streets and gardens had been. On the ground, the devastation defied description. In the heart of the blast, almost everything within a mile radius was destroyed. Stone buildings were reduced to rubble, wooden houses incinerated. People vanished in an instant, leaving only shadows behind. Beyond the center, thousands more were injured, burned, buried under debris. The city that had woken to a summer morning was gone. And yet, even in this destruction, life persisted. Survivors helped one another, carrying the wounded, giving water, searching for lost family. Priests opened temples, doctors treated the injured in shattered hospitals, neighbors offered whatever aid they could. Amid the silence of shock, voices rose, cries of pain, whispers of prayer, calls for help. In Washington, in Tokyo, in Los Alamos, news would spread slowly. But in Hiroshima, the truth was immediate, etched into flesh and stone. The bomb had been used. The atom's fire had been unleashed not in desert emptiness but in a living city. For the scientists, the generals, and the president, this was the test of their decision. For the people of Hiroshima, it was the end of the world they had known. As the day wore on, fires burned into the night. The mushroom cloud drifted, casting ash like snow across the ruins. The rivers ran dark with silt and debris. Survivors gathered in makeshift shelters, many too stunned to speak. The city, once alive with trams, bicycles, and school children's voices, was silent. At dawn on August 6th, Hiroshima had been a place of ordinary life. By noon, it was a wound on the earth. The atom, dreamed of by philosophers, split by scientists, carried by soldiers, had now become a weapon of war. And in that moment, the world understood, the future would forever live in its shadow. Part 9. Nagasaki. 3 days had passed since Hiroshima. The world outside Japan did not yet know the full scale of what had happened there. Reports were confused, censored, or simply disbelieved. In Tokyo, leaders debated in darkened rooms, trying to grasp what new weapon America had used. In Washington, officials prepared their next move. And in the skies over the Pacific, another bomber squadron made ready. The target was originally Kokura, a city known for its arsenal and industrial works. but clouds and smoke obscured it on the morning of August 9, 1945. Pilots turned toward their secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki was different from Hiroshima. Built along a deep harbor and surrounded by hills, it was a city of narrow valleys and winding streets. Its history stretched back centuries as one of Japan's ports of trade with the outside world. Dutch and Portuguese merchants had once walked its docks. Christian missionaries had built churches there, and though persecution had nearly erased them, Nagasaki remained a place where Japan and the West had touched. In 1945, it was a city of factories, shipyards, neighborhoods, and faith. That morning dawned humid and gray. Clouds drifted over the hills, softening the light. People went about their routines with the tired persistence of a nation at war. Women lined up for food rations. Men reported to factories that still produced arms despite shortages. Children played in courtyards, their voices rising between the houses. Priests prayed in churches that stood quietly among wooden homes. At 11 a.m., the sound of aircraft engines grew above the city. Some looked up, but many had grown accustomed to planes overhead. Few alarms sounded. Life continued for one more fragile moment. Then, at 11:02 a.m., the second atomic bomb exploded. This one was different from Hiroshima's. Where Little Boy had used uranium, Fat Man used plutonium, its core imploded by carefully arranged explosives. Its design was more complex, its yield even greater. When it detonated over the Urakami Valley, the world cracked open again. The flash was instantaneous, a white fire swallowing the sky. Hills reflected it, valleys magnified it, and within seconds the northern half of the city was flattened. The explosion tore through houses and factories, snapping beams, hurling debris, igniting fires. A blast wave rolled down streets and across the harbor, carrying with it dust, smoke, and silence. At the center of the detonation stood the Urakami Cathedral, once the largest Christian church in East Asia. It was reduced to rubble in an instant. Statues of Mary and saints were shattered, bells torn from towers, worshippers consumed in light. Later, fragments of scorched statues would be found, silent witnesses of faith in the midst of destruction. Thousands died instantly, vaporized in the fireball or crushed beneath collapsing structures. Thousands more were wounded, staggering through streets that no longer existed, their bodies burned, their voices hoarse. Rivers filled with people seeking relief, water becoming a refuge and a grave. The mushroom cloud rose again, towering over the city. From the air, pilots saw the same sight they had seen at Hiroshima, a boiling column, beautiful and terrible, marking the spot where a city had been. For those on the ground, there were no words. Survivors wandered through smoke, calling for family members who would never answer. Doctors and nurses who remained alive treated the injured in makeshift shelters, their supplies gone within hours. Priests pulled survivors from rubble and prayed over the dying. Mothers held children, searching in vain for safety. The geography of Nagasaki spared some areas, as hills shielded neighborhoods from the full force. Unlike Hiroshima, the destruction was not uniform. Valleys closer to the blast were obliterated, while districts behind ridges stood battered but standing. Yet the suffering was no less. Tens of thousands were killed, and the city's spirit was scarred forever. News of Nagasaki spread more quickly than Hiroshima. Japan's leaders could no longer deny that America possessed not one but multiple such weapons. In Tokyo, the cabinet met in urgent session. Some argued for surrender, others for continued resistance. The emperor himself, long silent, began to lean toward ending the war. In America, officials saw Nagasaki as confirmation. The bomb was not an accident of one city or one day. It was a force that could be repeated. Truman announced that if Japan did not surrender, more would follow. For the scientists, news of the second bombing brought mixed emotions: relief that the war might end, sorrow that another city had been destroyed. For the people of Nagasaki, however, the future was distant. The present was unbearable. Fires burned into the night. Smoke covered the sky. Families searched through rubble, their hands raw, their hearts broken. Bodies were laid side by side in fields, survivors too few and too weak to bury them all. Among the ruins of the Urakami Cathedral, fragments of Christian statues lay scattered. One was a head of the Virgin Mary, its eyes blackened, its face scarred. It became a symbol of Nagasaki's suffering, a reminder that no faith, no city, no people were beyond the reach of the atom's fire. As evening fell on August 9th, silence returned. The blast was over, the fires still smoldering, the mushroom cloud gone. But the city had changed forever. Where trams had run, where bells had tolled, where children had played, there was now only devastation. 3 days, 2 cities, 2 flashes of light brighter than the sun. Hiroshima had been the first, Nagasaki the second. Together they marked the entry of humanity into a new age, one where the atom's secret was not just known but used. The war was nearing its end, but the questions were only beginning. Part 10. The World Reacts. The mushroom clouds had risen, the cities had burned, and the silence that followed was unlike any silence before. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were gone. But beyond the ruins, the world was still waking to the reality of what had happened. News traveled unevenly. In Japan, where censorship and chaos blurred truth, the first reports were fragmented. Radio stations spoke of new types of bombs. Government officials received telegrams describing destruction too great to be caused by ordinary explosives. Eyewitness accounts filtered in, entire districts leveled, lights so bright it burned shadows into walls, thousands dying where they stood. At first, many leaders refused to believe it. Could a single weapon truly do this? Was it exaggeration, or confusion in the fog of war? But as hours turned to days, disbelief gave way to grim acknowledgement. Survivors streamed out of the ruins, their bodies scorched, their voices hoarse. Pilots flying reconnaissance confirmed that Hiroshima had been flattened, Nagasaki shattered. Doctors reported strange injuries, burns unlike any they had seen, sickness spreading among those who had seemed unhurt at first. Slowly, the truth took form. Japan had been struck by something entirely new, a weapon unlike any in human history. In Tokyo, the news reached the imperial palace. The cabinet convened intense meetings, divided between those who urged surrender and those who demanded resistance. The bombings tipped the balance. Combined with the Soviet Union's sudden declaration of war against Japan, they made clear that the nation's position was hopeless. For the emperor, who had long remained silent, the moment had come to speak. In America, the first announcement came from President Harry Truman. On August 6th, only hours after Hiroshima had been destroyed, he addressed the nation. His words were measured but momentous. He told the public that a new weapon, a harnessing of the basic power of the universe, had been used against Japan. He described Hiroshima as a military target, insisted that the bomb was a necessary step to end the war, and warned that more would follow if Japan did not surrender. For many Americans, the reaction was relief and celebration. After years of war, Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the hope that the conflict might finally end was overwhelming. Newspapers printed bold headlines: "Atomic bomb destroys Hiroshima." Crowds cheered in city streets. Soldiers abroad wrote letters home, telling families that perhaps the end was near. In factories and farms, people felt that the sacrifices of war might finally yield peace. Yet alongside celebration, there was unease. The descriptions of destruction, once confirmed, were staggering. Some Americans asked whether it had been necessary to strike cities filled with civilians. Others wondered what this weapon might mean for the future. Editorials spoke of the atomic age, of a new chapter in history that had opened with fire. Among scientists, reactions were divided. Many at Los Alamos felt relief, even pride, that their years of work had achieved the intended result. The bomb had functioned, the war might end. But others felt sorrow, even guilt. They had built it in the name of defeating Hitler, yet it had been used against Japan after Germany's defeat. Some had urged a demonstration, a warning, rather than the destruction of cities. Their petitions had gone unheard. Now they saw photographs of ruins, read accounts of suffering, and questioned their role. For Oppenheimer, the burden deepened. He had led the effort, and now he carried the knowledge of what it had done. In Britain, the reaction was one of astonishment. Winston Churchill, though no longer Prime Minister, wrote later of his amazement at the weapon's power. He saw it as both salvation and peril, a means to end the war but also a force that might one day threaten civilization itself. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin listened carefully when Truman, at Potsdam, casually mentioned America's new weapon. Stalin, outwardly unimpressed, already knew of the project through espionage. But when the bombs fell on Japan, he grasped their meaning, a new balance of power, a new arms race already begun. Soviet scientists were ordered to accelerate their own efforts. The world was dividing into nuclear powers and all others. In the streets of Tokyo, Osaka, and smaller towns across Japan, the ordinary people reacted with shock and grief. Families searched for news of relatives in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, often in vain. Survivors who stumbled from the ruins told stories almost beyond belief. Skies lit brighter than day, winds that tore buildings apart, burns that appeared in the shape of clothing patterns pressed into flesh. Rumors spread of invisible poisons, of sickness that struck even those uninjured at first. The word Gensha Bakudan, atomic bomb, entered the language, carrying with it both awe and terror. The emperor's voice, rarely heard, soon reached his people. On August 15th, he addressed the nation by radio, announcing surrender. He spoke in formal, archaic Japanese, words difficult for many to understand, but the message was clear: the war was over. For most, it was the first time they had heard his voice. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb whose power had forced his hand. For the Japanese people, the shock was doubled, not only surrender, but the realization that their nation had been undone by a single weapon. Elsewhere in the world, the bombings sparked debate that would continue for decades. Some saw them as necessary, the only way to end the war quickly, sparing both American and Japanese lives that would have been lost in an invasion. Others saw them as a crime, an unnecessary act of destruction, a warning to the Soviets disguised as strategy. But in August 1945, as smoke still rose from the ruins, the immediate reaction was more visceral. The bomb had ended the war. It had also begun something else. Writers and journalists spoke of the dawn of the atomic age. Editorials speculated on what nuclear energy might mean: power plants, medical breakthroughs, or weapons of even greater scale. Ordinary people wondered if cities could ever be safe again, if war would now mean annihilation. Children in America and Europe heard their parents speak of bombs that could destroy entire nations. Fear entered homes alongside victory. In the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors gathered strength in small acts of humanity. They cared for the wounded, shared food, searched for lost relatives, and rebuilt temples. Amid destruction, they carried life forward. Yet the scars, physical, emotional, cultural, would remain for generations. For the world, August 1945 was a hinge in time. On one side lay the age of conventional war, of bombs and bullets and firestorms. On the other lay the nuclear age, defined by the knowledge that humanity could destroy itself with a single decision. The reactions varied: joy, sorrow, triumph, dread, but all shared the same realization: the world had changed forever. The war was ending, but the shadow of the bomb would remain. Part 11. The Nuclear Age Begins. When the Emperor of Japan spoke to his people on August 15, 1945, the Second World War ended. The guns grew quiet, the ships lowered their flags, and soldiers everywhere began the long journey home. But even as peace returned, the world felt different. Humanity had crossed a threshold in fire and light, and the new age that followed was defined not only by relief but by unease. The atomic bomb had not simply ended the war. It had opened a new chapter of history. People everywhere sensed it. Newspapers called it the dawn of the atomic age. Politicians spoke of a revolution in power. Scientists warned of a future shaped not by progress alone but by fear. For the first time, human beings had created a weapon capable not just of winning wars but of erasing civilization. In America, the first reactions were triumphant. The war was over, victory assured, and the bomb was hailed as the tool that had brought it. Crowds gathered in Times Square, waving flags, cheering for soldiers. Newspapers described the bombs as miracles of science, proof of American ingenuity. Photographs of mushroom clouds were printed with a mixture of awe and pride. Yet beneath the surface, a quieter current of anxiety began to flow. The descriptions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cities flattened, tens of thousands killed in an instant, were too large to fully absorb. People struggled to imagine what it meant that such destruction could be unleashed by a single weapon. It was both distant and intimate. Distant because the bomb had fallen across the ocean, intimate because the same power now belonged to the world they lived in. Leaders spoke of the promise of atomic energy. They imagined cities powered by nuclear reactors, electricity too cheap to meter, scientific advances that would lift humanity to new heights. But ordinary people felt the darker promise more strongly. If the bomb could end one war, it could also begin another. And in that knowledge lay a seed of fear that would grow for decades. In the Soviet Union, Stalin wasted no time. Even before the war ended, Soviet intelligence had already gathered details of the Manhattan Project through spies at Los Alamos and elsewhere. Now, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki as proof, the Soviet program accelerated. Within 4 years, the USSR tested its own bomb, ending America's monopoly. The world was now divided into nuclear powers and non-nuclear nations, a balance of terror replacing any illusion of safety. For ordinary people, the nuclear age became part of daily life. In the United States, schools began to conduct duck and cover drills. Children sat under desks, hands over their necks, told that this would protect them from atomic blasts. Sirens were tested in cities, their wailing a reminder that destruction could come from the sky at any moment. Civil defense campaigns urged families to build fallout shelters, stocked with canned food, water, and flashlights. Magazines printed guides on how to survive nuclear war. Companies sold shelter kits, and suburban yards sometimes hid underground bunkers. Families spoke in hushed tones of what they would do if the sirens ever sounded for real. The culture reflected the new age in countless ways. Movies depicted atomic monsters rising from the sea, their bodies warped by radiation. Comic books gave heroes powers from nuclear accidents, a fantasy of control over what otherwise brought only fear. Advertisements used the word atomic to sell everything from cars to household appliances, as though the new age was both terrifying and glamorous. But fear ran deeper. People knew, in a way they had never known before, that the end of the world was no longer only a matter for myths or religions. It could happen by human hands, in minutes, with the press of a button. The mushroom cloud became an icon, both warning and symbol. In Japan, the age began differently. For survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hibakusha, the nuclear age was not theoretical. It lived in their bodies, in their memories, in the ruins of their cities. They bore scars, both visible and hidden. Many suffered from radiation sickness, illnesses that appeared weeks, months, or years after the blast. Families lost generations in a single day. Survivors were often shunned, feared by neighbors who worried that their sickness might spread. Yet they also became voices of witness, speaking quietly of what they had endured. The cities themselves became symbols. Hiroshima built a peace memorial park, centered around the skeletal remains of the Genbaku Dome, a building that had stood near the blast center. Nagasaki rebuilt its cathedral and raised statues calling for peace. Each August, ceremonies marked the anniversaries, bells tolling, lanterns floating on rivers, voices calling for a world without nuclear weapons. For scientists, the nuclear age was also a reckoning. Some returned to universities and laboratories, determined never again to work on weapons. Others entered government, advising on policy, warning of arms races. A few, like Edward Teller, pressed forward, advocating for even more powerful hydrogen bombs. Debate within the scientific community mirrored the world's conflict: hope for peace, fear of annihilation. Politically, the nuclear age shaped diplomacy. The United Nations was founded in 1945 with the hope of preventing future wars, but almost immediately nuclear weapons loomed over its meetings. America proposed international control of atomic energy, but mistrust between nations made agreement impossible. Instead, the arms race grew. And so, as the 1940s ended and the 1950s began, the world settled into a strange new rhythm, half triumph, half dread. The war was over, yet fear lingered. Children played in streets, yet sirens tested above them. Families bought televisions and refrigerators, yet stored cans of food for a disaster they prayed would never come. The nuclear age was not only about bombs. It was about living with the knowledge of them, about carrying in daily life the awareness that everything could change in an instant. It was about hope and fear intertwined, about a future both brighter and darker than any imagined before. From the deserts of New Mexico to the ruins of Hiroshima, from the classrooms of America to the halls of the Kremlin, the message was the same: humanity had entered a new era. The atom had been split, its fire unleashed. The nuclear age had begun. Part 12. The Arms Race. The atomic bomb had ended one war, but in its shadow another began. The world breathed a sigh of relief when peace returned in 1945, yet almost immediately a new tension filled the air. The war between nations was finished, but the competition between powers was only beginning. The United States emerged from the Second World War as the only country with nuclear weapons. For a brief moment, it held a monopoly on the most powerful force ever created. Politicians spoke of this as a guarantee of security, a shield against future wars. Some imagined that the bomb itself might ensure peace, that no nation would dare challenge America if it could unleash such destruction again. But history does not allow monopolies for long. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin had already given the order: the Soviet Union would build its own bomb. Through a mixture of determined science and carefully placed espionage, the Soviet program advanced quickly. Soviet physicists, many brilliant in their own right, combined their own work with secrets stolen from the Manhattan Project. 4 years after Hiroshima, in 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. The monopoly was gone. The arms race had begun. For the United States, the Soviet test was a shock. What had seemed like an advantage suddenly became a question of survival. If America could be destroyed as easily as it had destroyed Hiroshima, then the balance of power had shifted. Leaders in Washington debated their response. The answer came swiftly: build something even bigger. The next step was the hydrogen bomb, sometimes called the H-bomb or thermonuclear bomb. Unlike the fission weapons dropped on Japan, which split heavy nuclei apart, the hydrogen bomb would fuse light nuclei together, the same process that powered the sun. Fusion released far more energy than fission, and the potential yields were staggering. The idea had existed even before the war ended, whispered in discussions at Los Alamos. Some scientists, like Edward Teller, pressed hard for it, convinced that the future of American security lay in ever more powerful weapons. Others recoiled, warning that such bombs would be capable of destroying entire nations. But once the Soviets had their bomb, the debate narrowed. In 1950, President Truman authorized the development of the hydrogen bomb. On November 1, 1952, the United States tested the first true thermonuclear device, codenamed Ivy Mike, on Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific. The explosion vaporized an island, leaving behind a crater more than a mile wide. The fireball was many times brighter than the sun, the mushroom cloud rising more than 130,000 feet into the atmosphere. The scale dwarfed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Humanity had created not just a bomb, but a weapon capable of erasing entire cities in an instant. The Soviets followed quickly. In 1953, they tested their own hydrogen bomb, smaller in size but still devastating. The race intensified. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, both superpowers were producing bombs not by the dozen but by the thousands. Missiles replaced planes as delivery systems. Submarines carried warheads beneath the oceans, invisible and silent. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction emerged. The idea that if either side launched an attack, the other could retaliate with equal or greater force, ensuring that both would be annihilated. Peace, paradoxically, was maintained by the certainty of destruction. For ordinary people, the arms race became a constant presence. In America, civil defense films instructed children to duck and cover. Posters showed families stocking fallout shelters. Air raid sirens were tested in cities, their long wails reminding citizens that the end could come at any moment. In the Soviet Union, similar drills were carried out, with citizens taught how to seek cover, though all knew that survival was unlikely in a real attack. The numbers grew beyond comprehension. By the 1960s, the United States and Soviet Union each possessed thousands of nuclear warheads, enough to destroy the world many times over. The language of security became surreal. The measure of safety was the ability to destroy humanity more completely than one's opponent. And yet, even in this madness, science advanced. The same technology that built bombs also fueled reactors, generating electricity. Nuclear submarines sailed for months without refueling. Medical isotopes were developed to treat disease. The atom was both weapon and tool, promise and threat. The arms race was not only about weapons, it was also about fear. Families dug basements into shelters, stocking them with canned beans and flashlights. Governments distributed pamphlets showing how to survive fallout. In schools, children practiced hiding under desks, though teachers knew it would make little difference. Anxiety seeped into culture. Novels and films imagined worlds destroyed by nuclear fire, cities turned to ash, survivors wandering through wastelands. And yet life continued. People went to work, raised families, watched television, planned vacations. Beneath it all lay the quiet knowledge that in minutes the world could change forever. Diplomats tried to slow the race. Treaties were proposed, tested, signed, and sometimes broken. Talks in Geneva, Moscow, and Washington sought to limit testing, to cap stockpiles, to build trust. Yet mistrust ran deep. Each side suspected the other of deception, and so the bombs kept being built. The nuclear age was becoming a permanent condition. The arms race defined international politics, shaped budgets, guided foreign policy. Smaller nations began their own programs. Britain tested a bomb, then France, then China. The club of nuclear powers grew, each new member raising the stakes. And always, the shadow of war hovered. Crises flared, in Korea, in Berlin, in Cuba. Each confrontation carried the fear that it might tip into nuclear conflict. Each time, leaders pulled back, the balance preserved, but the fear renewed. For those who lived through it, the arms race was not only about strategy. It was about the weight of possibility. Children lay in bed at night, listening to sirens, wondering if their cities would be there in the morning. Soldiers stood guard in missile silos, waiting for orders that might never come. Scientists drew equations that could end humanity, and then went home to dine with their families. The arms race was a paradox. It prevented war by threatening total war, preserved peace by holding destruction in readiness. It was a balance built on fear, on logic, on the hope that no leader would ever press the button first. By the end of the 20th century, treaties would reduce the stockpiles, and the numbers would decline. But in the decades after 1945, the race consumed nations, money, and minds. The bomb had not ended conflict. It had reshaped it into something global, existential, permanent. The arms race was the price of splitting the atom. And for generations, humanity lived beneath its shadow, wondering not whether the bombs could be used again, but whether someday they would. Part 13. Moments on the Brink. The arms race had filled stockpiles with thousands of warheads, each many times more powerful than the bombs that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Missiles stood ready in silos dug into the earth, bombers flew patrols in endless loops, and submarines carried weapons silently beneath the seas. The balance of terror was constant, and with it came moments when the world edged so close to catastrophe that survival depended on hesitation, restraint, or sheer chance. In Europe, Berlin was one of the first great pressure points. After the Second World War, Germany was divided, and within its Soviet zone, the city of Berlin was split between the victors. West Berlin became an island of democracy deep inside communist territory, a symbol for the West and a thorn to the East. In 1948, Joseph Stalin tried to squeeze the city into submission by blockading all land routes. Trains, trucks, and roads were cut off. For months the people of West Berlin survived only because American and British planes flew in food and coal. It was a strange war of endurance fought not with bullets but with airplanes carrying bread. The Soviets could have shot the planes down, but they did not. The world held its breath, and then the blockade lifted. A crisis had passed, but Berlin remained a fault line. In 1961, the wall went up, dividing the city overnight. Tanks faced each other at Checkpoint Charlie, their guns aimed across a narrow street. Soldiers waited in silence, and families cried at the barbed wire that cut them apart. Yet once again, after days of tense standoff, the tanks withdrew. The most dangerous moment came in October 1962. In Cuba, Less than 100 miles from the American shore, Soviet missiles were being installed. To the Soviets, it was balance. The Americans had placed missiles in Turkey, pointed toward Moscow. By putting their own in Cuba, Khrushchev hoped to redress the scales. But when reconnaissance planes brought back photographs, President John F. Kennedy faced an unthinkable choice. If the missiles became operational, American cities would lie under sudden threat. His advisors argued. Some urged immediate airstrikes and invasion, certain that only force would solve the problem. Others warned that such actions would ignite war. Kennedy chose another path. He ordered a naval blockade, calling it a quarantine, to prevent more Soviet ships from delivering cargo. For 13 days, the world seemed to hold its breath. Warships steamed toward each other in the Caribbean. Submarines lurked beneath the waves. American bombers circled with nuclear weapons aboard, while Soviet commanders readied their forces. Radio broadcasts described each step, and ordinary people followed the news with growing dread. In farmhouses and apartments, in city streets and rural towns, the question hung in the air: would this be the end? At the height of the crisis, a U.S. reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba. Military leaders demanded retaliation, but Kennedy held back, knowing that one strike could ignite a chain of events no one could control. Letters passed between Washington and Moscow, first filled with threats, then with pleas. Finally, an agreement emerged. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles, and the United States would pledge not to invade Cuba. In a separate, secret deal, America agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey. The ships turned back, the world exhaled, and catastrophe had been avoided, barely. Not all brushes with disaster were so visible. Some came silently, born of error and accident. In 1983, a Soviet early warning system signaled that American missiles had been launched. The alarms blared, screens lit with data, and the officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, faced a choice. Protocol demanded that he report the attack, which would have triggered a Soviet response. But Petrov hesitated. The warning seemed odd. The number of missiles was small, too small for a real first strike. Trusting his instincts, he judged it a false alarm. He was right. The signals came from sunlight reflecting off high clouds. His decision, made in a quiet control room, may have prevented a nuclear war. There were other close calls, radar mistakes, bomber patrols straying too near, computer errors that flashed red on screens. Again and again, human judgment stood between peace and destruction. From these near disasters, a grim logic emerged. Peace was to be preserved not by trust but by terror. The doctrine was called deterrence. Each side held enough weapons to destroy the other many times over. To strike first would invite certain death in return. It was called mutually assured destruction, a phrase that carried its own dark irony. In this way, survival depended on fear, and stability balanced on the certainty of annihilation. For ordinary people, the brink became part of life. In American schools, children practiced duck and cover drills, crouching beneath desks as though wood and metal could shield them from atomic fire. Families dug basements into shelters, stocking them with canned beans, water, and radios. In the Soviet Union, citizens rehearsed drills of their own, while propaganda promised survival in bunkers. Yet everyone knew the truth: survival was unlikely. The knowledge seeped into culture. Novels told of ruined landscapes, films showed mushroom clouds on distant horizons, songs warned of a tomorrow that might never come. And yet, even with fear so close, daily life persisted. Weddings were celebrated, harvests gathered, children were born. People fell in love, built homes, planted gardens, and dreamed of futures that might or might not arrive. The brink became a strange companion, always near but never fully visible, shaping thought without stopping life. History remembers the crises that ended without catastrophe, but each of them could have turned differently. If a commander at Berlin had fired his gun in 1961, if Kennedy had ordered airstrikes in Cuba, if Petrov had trusted the alarms in 1983, if a radar operator had misread his screen. In each case, humanity had balanced on the edge, and in each case, chance and restraint had pulled it back. The nuclear age was not only about weapons, it was about the choices made in silence, the moments when destruction was close and someone, somewhere, decided to wait. These were the moments on the brink, when civilization hovered at the edge of its own power, and the future depended on hesitation rather than action. Part 14. Living with the Bomb. By the mid-20th century, nuclear weapons had become more than machines of war. They were symbols, shadows, and silent companions. They sat in silos and submarines, but they also lodged themselves in the imagination of entire nations. To live in the nuclear age was not only to live under the threat of destruction, but to learn how to carry that threat in everyday life. Children were the first to absorb this strange education. In American schools, lessons were interrupted by civil defense drills. Teachers told students to crawl beneath their desks, cover their heads with their hands, and wait for the danger to pass. Animated films, like the famous Duck and Cover Turtle, showed cheerful characters demonstrating survival techniques. The instructions were simple, almost comforting, but beneath them lay the terrible truth. No desk, no hallway, no basement could truly protect against nuclear fire. Yet the ritual of the drill gave a sense of action, as if by crouching and covering, children could make themselves less vulnerable. In the Soviet Union, schools practiced similar drills. Sirens wailed, students filed into bunkers or basements, and officials spoke of preparedness. Across the world, childhood was shaped by the possibility that life could change in an instant. Families carried the weight in their homes. In suburban neighborhoods, basements were reinforced with concrete, stocked with canned beans, powdered milk, flashlights, and Geiger counters. Some magazines carried designs for fallout shelters, complete with bunk beds and filtered air systems. Advertisements promised peace of mind, selling survival as though it were another household convenience. Yet for every family that built a shelter, many more only talked about it, caught between the desire to prepare and the unwillingness to believe the worst might happen. People lived with the knowledge, but they also lived with denial. It was easier to buy a new car, plant a garden, or watch television than to sit in a dark shelter imagining apocalypse. Culture reflected the unease. The mushroom cloud became a recurring image, printed in newspapers, painted on posters, shown on television screens. It was both fascinating and terrifying, a symbol of power and fragility. Films imagined worlds destroyed by nuclear war, cities reduced to ash, survivors wandering in wastelands. Some movies made the threat fantastical, with monsters born of radiation rising from the sea. Others confronted it directly, showing governments weighing decisions that could erase the world. In books and songs, the bomb became metaphor, warning, and confession. Artists and writers wrestled with the knowledge that beauty, progress, and love existed alongside the possibility of instant annihilation. Protest grew alongside fear. In the 1950s and 1960s, marches filled city streets with people demanding an end to nuclear testing. Mothers carried banners pleading for the safety of their children, arguing that fallout drifted through the air and into milk. Students gathered on campuses, singing songs of peace, warning that the arms race could end only in ashes. Across the world, groups formed, dedicated to disarmament. Some were small circles of activists, others grew into global movements. Their voices rose in opposition, even as governments continued to build new bombs. Religion also found itself reshaped. Some saw nuclear weapons as a sign of human hubris, the temptation to wield godlike power without wisdom. Clergy preached sermons about stewardship, sin, and the fragile gift of creation. Others interpreted the bomb as part of prophecy, a fulfillment of apocalyptic visions long foretold. For many believers, the mushroom cloud was both a warning and a call to humility, to peace, to a deeper reflection on humanity's place in the universe. The military carried the burden differently. Soldiers trained not only to fight conventional wars but also to survive in nuclear battlefields. Manuals instructed troops on how to march through fallout, how to wear protective gear, how to operate in silence under skies that might be filled with radiation. Exercises were staged in deserts where mock towns were built, only to be destroyed by nuclear tests. Soldiers watched from trenches as bombs exploded miles away, the light blinding, the shockwaves rolling through the ground. These men returned with stories of heat, dust, and fear, reminders that the bomb was not only theory but practice. Diplomats faced their own challenges. The arms race forced nations to negotiate, to talk even when mistrust ran deep. Treaties were signed to limit testing, to slow the spread of weapons, to set boundaries. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 ended atmospheric tests, driving them underground. The Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 sought to prevent the spread of weapons to more nations, though not all agreed to sign. Each step was fragile, often imperfect, yet each was also a recognition that life under the bomb demanded cooperation as much as rivalry. Living with nuclear weapons was not always dramatic. Often it was quiet, a background hum. It was the siren tested at noon in a city square, the magazine ad for a fallout shelter, the news broadcast mentioning negotiations in Geneva. It was the dream of a child who had seen a mushroom cloud in a film, the anxiety of a parent reading about new warheads tested, the whispered conversation of lovers wondering what the future would hold. The bomb was not always spoken of directly, but it was always there, shaping choices and moods in ways both subtle and profound. For the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, living with the bomb meant something else entirely. Their presence gave the world a human face to the abstract. Scarred bodies, illnesses carried for decades, memories of unbearable mornings, these bore witness to what nuclear weapons meant in reality. Many hibakusha spoke publicly, often against indifference or denial, urging the world never to forget. Their testimony became part of the fabric of the nuclear age, a reminder that behind the statistics and doctrines lay lives broken and communities erased. The decades stretched on. People learned to carry the weight. They celebrated birthdays, built careers, wrote poems, fell in love. And always, somewhere in the background, missiles waited, warheads gleamed, submarines patrolled in silence. The bomb was no longer a new invention but part of existence itself. Humanity had adapted, but the adaptation came at a cost. It meant accepting that civilization lived under its own sword, suspended by threads of politics and chance. Living with the bomb was to live with contradiction. It was to believe in progress while fearing annihilation. It was to build schools, roads, and families under skies that might one day burn. It was to laugh and dance while knowing that the world could be erased in minutes. It was to hold both hope and dread in the same heart. The bomb had not been used again in war, yet it shaped every war after it. Conflicts were fought cautiously, knowing escalation could trigger destruction on a scale beyond imagination. The weapon became both shield and threat, deterrent and danger. To live with it was to live with paradox, that peace depended on terror, that survival required restraint, that security was purchased not by safety but by fear. Decade after decade, humanity lived with the bomb. It became part of the rhythm of life, a shadow never far from sight, a silence behind every decision, a truth that could not be ignored. And though generations grew accustomed, the weight never truly disappeared. It lingered, in dreams, in culture, in politics, in prayer. It lingered as a reminder that once the atom had been split, once the fire had been set free, the world could never return to what it had been before. Part 15. The Shadow of Forever. The bomb was born in secrecy, tested in desert silence, and unleashed in fire over 2 cities. In the years that followed, it multiplied, spread, and seeped into every corner of human life. Generations lived beneath its presence, sometimes openly fearful, sometimes quietly resigned. Even now, as the 21st century moves forward, the shadow of the bomb has not lifted. It remains, not as a memory alone, but as a permanent condition of existence. The Cold War ended decades ago. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the language of East versus West softened. Many hoped that the danger might pass with it, that nuclear weapons would fade into irrelevance, relics of an anxious age. But the weapons remained. They were not dismantled in full. They were reduced, counted, locked away, yet never unmade. To this day, thousands of warheads lie in arsenals, enough to destroy the world many times over. The bomb still exists, silent but alive, ready at a moment's notice. Living with it now feels different than it did in the 1950s or 1960s. The drills in schools are mostly gone. Sirens no longer wail in city streets each week. Families no longer stock canned food in backyard bunkers. The presence is quieter, more abstract, tucked away behind the constant noise of modern life. And yet it is still there. It surfaces in headlines about arms treaties, in tensions between nations, in the rare but chilling mention of nuclear threats. It lingers in the awareness that the power discovered in 1945 has never been set aside. For survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many of whom have grown old while carrying scars of that morning, the shadow is not abstract. They lived through what the bomb can do, and their memories remain testimony. Each year, on the anniversaries, lanterns float on rivers in Japan, candles are lit, and bells toll for peace. The hibakusha speak, sometimes to crowds of school children, sometimes to world leaders. Their voices calm but insistent, never again. Their words remind the world that the shadow is not theory but lived truth. In culture, the bomb still echoes. It appears in films, novels, and art, sometimes as symbol, sometimes as warning. Writers and directors imagine futures scarred by nuclear fire, or alternate pasts where the weapons were never used. Musicians sing of mushroom clouds, of fears handed down through generations. Even when not spoken of directly, the idea of instant annihilation still shapes the human imagination. It reminds us that progress and destruction are bound together, that invention carries both light and fire. In politics, the bomb remains a bargaining chip. Nations that hold it guard their power. Nations that do not sometimes seek it, hoping for the safety it seems to grant. The spread of nuclear weapons has been slowed but not stopped. Each new nation that acquires them deepens the shadow, making the balance more fragile. Diplomats meet, treaties are signed, verification teams travel the world, yet mistrust never fully fades. The promise of disarmament remains distant, often spoken, rarely acted upon. For ordinary people, the bomb is both near and far. It rarely intrudes into daily thought, yet it lies in the background of every major crisis, every confrontation between powerful nations. It is present in the silence of submarines beneath the ocean, in the guarded silos of planes and steppes, in the decisions of leaders who may never meet but who hold humanity's fate in their hands. It is present in the unspoken awareness that technology has outpaced wisdom, that the capacity to destroy is always faster than the capacity to heal. The shadow of the bomb is also a teacher. It has shown humanity what it is capable of, both in genius and in horror. It has revealed the heights of scientific achievement and the depths of destruction those achievements can bring. It has forced generations to confront questions of morality, responsibility, and survival. What does it mean to hold in human hands the power once attributed only to gods or fate? What does it mean to live with the knowledge that everything built could vanish in moments? And so humanity continues forward, carrying both fear and hope. The bomb has not been used again in war since 1945. That in itself is remarkable. It is evidence of restraint, diplomacy, luck, and perhaps a deep, unspoken understanding that to cross that line again might end everything. Yet the danger remains, and the possibility lingers. It is a shadow not of the past but of the present, stretching forward into the future. The story of the bomb is not finished. It began in quiet laboratories, in chalk marks on blackboards, in letters passed between scientists. It burst into history with flashes of light and waves of fire. It grew into arsenals, into doctrines, into fears. And it now rests in the hands of nations, silent but waiting. Its shadow is forever. For those who pause to think of it, the lesson is clear and unsettling. Human beings are both builders and destroyers. They can create beauty and devastation from the same spark of imagination. They can split the atom and light cities with its energy, or they can split it and turn cities to ash. To live in the age of the bomb is to carry both possibilities at once. Perhaps someday the weapons will be dismantled, the silos emptied, the warheads dismantled, the submarines refitted for other work. Perhaps humanity will step out from under the shadow. But until then, the shadow remains, long and dark, a reminder of choices made in the past and choices still to come. It is the shadow of forever, and we live within it. The story of the atom bomb is a story of light and shadow, of discovery and destruction, of brilliance and burden. From quiet laboratories to devastated cities, from moments on the brink to the quiet rhythms of daily life, it has shaped the world we live in. Its shadow still lingers, reminding us of what humanity can create, and what it must learn to control. If you've made it this far into the journey, thank you for listening. I'd love to invite you to support the channel. Please remember to like this video, subscribe if you haven't yet, and share a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. It means more than you know, and it helps keep these stories alive. Now it's time to let the weight of history fade into stillness. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and allow yourself to drift. The world is quiet here, and for now, you are safe. Good night.